to another episode. In today's episode, I'm going to be going back to one of my favorite cameras, which I've done another video on, and that is the Alpa 7. But I've made a couple changes to it since the last video. So this is the Alpa 7 that I introduced and discussed in my previous Alpa 7 video. Now, as you can see, I'm going to be demonstrating a new lens that I've acquired for the camera, which is the lovely Angénieux 28mm f3.5. Now, there's an interesting story to the lens, of course, which I will share a little bit later. Now, since my last video, I have actually sourced a very inexpensive parts camera that actually came from the same batch, 1954 batch, as this Model 7. And from that camera, I was able to acquire the correct and original rewind knob that would have been original to this camera, which is the knob that permits the use of the AGVA Rapid cassette. So to keep this interesting, I'm going to be shooting with the AGVA Rapid cassette and using the Angénieux 28mm camera. Now, perhaps the more observant folks will recognize that when I said in the last video that the camera was designed to use AGVA Rapid cassettes, the camera was introduced in 1952, and AGVA Rapid cassettes were not introduced until 1964. So technically they were designed to work with the AGVA Cassette cassette, which is essentially the same thing as the later AGVA Rapid cassette, which I've covered in another video. So I'm going to be using an AGVA Rapid cassette. Technically, this would have been designed for the AGVA cassette, but for modern purposes, they're one and the same. So with that, let's load up the camera and take it out shooting. Okay, so the first thing to do is to get the camera ready for the AGVA cassette. As you can see, I've already loaded the film into my AGVA Rapid cassette. If you're interested in seeing how that process works, check out my Yashica 17.5 video. So to open the back of the camera, just like normal, and then what we'll need to do is change the orientation of the rewind knob so that the rewind fork, which would normally stick down into the standard 35mm cassette, is out of the way. And this rewind knob is specifically designed to be able to do that. So once the rewind fork is out of the way, then we move over to the take-up side, and the standard take-up spool in the Alpa 7 is removable, just held in place by a simple spring clip. And once that is out of the way, then there is space there for both the feed side and the take-up side of the AGVA Cassette, or in this case, AGVA Rapid cassettes. To the best of my knowledge, the Alpa second generation cameras from 1952 to 1954 were the only cameras that were ever made that were actually designed to accommodate both standard 35mm cassettes and AGVA Cassette cassettes. Now, this cross-compatibility was only included in the first couple years of the second generation of Alpa cameras. By 1954, even AGVA themselves had stopped producing cameras that took the AGVA Cassette, and so Alpa soon replaced the Cassette-compatible rewind knob with a ratcheting rewind knob, which I showed on my previous video. The AGVA Cassette cassette would later be revived in 1964 with a slight revision, and it became known as the AGVA Rapid. The physical size of the two cassettes is the same, so either one will fit into this camera. So once the film is loaded, I'll wind it once and fire off that shot, and then I will turn the little dial on the back to set the frame counter to 0. If you're interested in knowing more about the history of the AGVA Cassette versus the AGVA Rapid, again, I talk about it a little bit in my Yashica 17.5 videos. Okay, now that the film is loaded, the next thing I want to do is change out the Canon 50mm lens with the Angénieux 28mm lens that I'm going to be featuring in this video. Changing out the lens is very similar to any other camera. There's a little button that you press to release the bayonet mount, and then the new lens just goes on in place of the old one. Now let's talk a little bit about this lens before we take it out shooting. This lens is just gorgeous. In my opinion, this is one of the most beautiful lenses ever made. The fit and finish are just spectacular. I'll talk a little bit more about the history of the lens toward the end of the video, but for now, let's just admire the aesthetics. The satin anodized finish is the best I've ever seen for a lens of this era. It's got that interesting little aperture knob on top instead of a ring. Just a beautiful lens all around. Okay, let's take a closer look at this lovely lens and talk a little bit about its history. Now, as far as aesthetics go, this lens is second to none as far as I'm concerned. As I mentioned earlier, the fit and finish are just superb. This anodized finish, it's just satin smooth. I can't even describe how nice it is. It looks great, it feels great. It's honestly the best finish I've ever encountered with the camera. The controls themselves are all incredibly smooth as well, as you would expect. The aperture is set with this knob on top of the lens, a little different than your typical aperture ring, which would normally be around the edge of the lens. I find this actually really easy to use because it's actually very easy to see exactly what you have set, and with the dial being right there, it's easy to access the entire thing without having to reach down here and kind of look in some kind of awkward position. Just like the focus ring, the aperture control is just buttery smooth. It's so smooth, and the détentes click in solidly, but also release very easily. Just really well engineered. Now, the aperture is triggered automatically with the aperture linkage through here. So when you press the shutter button, a linkage inside this body here actually triggers the aperture. This was sort of an early version of automatic aperture that was used also on the Exacta cameras of the time. If you prefer to use manual aperture on the bottom of the lens, there's a switch to switch over to manual aperture. Now, the lens is focused by a ring on the front up here. There are depth of field markings on the barrel of the lens here, very easy to read. And like I said, all in all, it's just a really beautiful lens. The Angénieux 28mm is not just a beautiful lens and not just a wonderfully performing lens. This lens was actually the very first 28mm wide-angle lens ever designed for 35mm SLR cameras, being introduced in 1953. And this was made possible as a product of Pierre Angénieux's lens design genius, this being the second lens in his line of revolutionary retrofocus lenses. Angénieux's first retrofocus lens was the 35mm f2.5 that was released just a couple of years before this 28mm lens, and both of these lenses were developed under Angénieux's all-new retrofocus lens design, which for the first time allowed lenses wider than about 40mm to be designed for 35mm SLR cameras. Now, why is the design of retrofocus lenses such a big deal? For us to understand the place that this lens holds in the history of lens design, we need to go back to some lens design basics, starting with the concept of lens focal length and how that is calculated and measured for any given lens. The focal length of a lens is the distance between the optical center of the lens and the film plane, at least in film cameras, when the lens is focused at infinity. So with a simple single element symmetrical lens, the optical center of the lens is also the physical center of the lens. Now, if we look at more complex lens designs, the optical center of these types of lenses usually lies somewhere within the groups of elements that comprise the lens. So, for instance, if we look at the famous Tessar lens design, the optical center of this lens is right near the center of the two groups of lenses. Now, the trick with SLR cameras is, of course, you've got the mirror box where the mirror lies between the back of the lens and the film plane and has to swing within that space. So if you imagine the location of the lens and the location of the rearmost element of any lens, the closest you can get that rear element to the film plane without interfering with the operation of the mirror. For conventional lens designs, this results in a minimum focal length of about 40 millimeters. Now, Angénieux completely revolutionized this by introducing a brand new type of lens design, designed from the ground up in such a way that he was able to shift the optical center of the lens to a point behind the rearmost element of the lens. So the effective focal length of the lens could actually lie within the mirror box of the camera. This is really the only way that you can get a wide-angle lens to work with a single lens reflex camera. Now, Angénieux was not the only lens designer working on solving this problem in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Another lens came out of the Zeiss Jena, that's the East German Carl Zeiss factory, in 1950, and actually predated the Angénieux 35mm by about 6 months. The Zeiss Jena lens was also a 35mm lens, at least as marked, and some texts actually refer to that as the first retrofocus lens. It's debatable. The Zeiss Jena lens, although marked as a 35mm lens, was actually a 37mm lens, only marginally better than the theoretical 40mm minimum. The optical center of the Zeiss Jena lens was also virtually coincident with the back of the rearmost lens element. So yeah, they did succeed in pushing back the optical center of the lens, but not quite behind the rear element. In any case, the point is this was a problem that multiple lens manufacturers were working on, and Angénieux is generally credited as creating the first true retrofocus lens. This lens is certainly a celebration of Pierre Angénieux, and there's no question that he was a lens design genius. This lens was certainly one of his masterpieces, being just a revolutionary lens for a number of reasons, and also being a gorgeously finished lens and a true high-performing lens.